Orion Pictures has a lot in common with Orion, and not only that, the first Rambo was released by Orion, and the second already Orion made separately. Or the first Terminator was delivered to the cinema by Orion, and the second one is already Orion. Orion simply had a slightly longer lifespan, and so he fluttered around for a longer period. That's why Orion's flare was brighter. At some point in his life cycle, Orion could have even become Orion. But the parade of planets took place somewhere else, and the purchase of Orion fell through. After which producers Mario Kassar and Andrew Wagner already organized their own studio, which was named Orion. They approached to Orion twice, and this is a story about real professionals who wanted everything at once, but overdid and rushed. There are a lot of professionals in this story, and they all wanted the best. They just didn't know how. In the second half of the 70s, one of the oldest Hollywood studios, United Artists, was in turmoil. She released her first films back in 1919, after which a huge number of different cult films emerged from under her wing. They also produced Bond films, but in the 70s there was a crisis, and he made to the top of the studio. Studio owners and producers began to attack each other and try to seize control. The situation is standard. There were too many failures, and they were always someone else's fault. According to producers Arthur Krim, Robert Benjamin, and Eric Pliskov, Transamerica was to blame, which in the late 60s bought out United Artists and began doing everything wrong. It's all because the leadership of Transamerica was full of idiots. This company's building in San Francisco is constantly being blown up by aliens, trampled by Godzilla or someone else. Idiots annoy everyone. Now, however, this is already not their building, because the company was run by professionals. She fizzled out, and the building had to be sold. But it is still called by their name. All in all, Benjamin, Krim, and Pleskov were unhappy with the fact that their studio was heading for the abyss. And the Transamerica leadership believes that it was not their efforts she's rolling there, and it is not guilty of anything. During United Artists' huge success with Bond, he found opponents for himself in every corner of the world, from the USSR to Jamaica, dealt with a nuclear bomber in the Bahamas, piloted a plane in Japan, fighting off hanging on the tail combat helicopters, and of course prevented nuclear war several times. But not necessarily be Agent 007, to become a participant in a dynamic military blockbuster. In 1978 Benjamin Krim and Pluskov resigned. 3 days after this event, at United Artists yet two vice presidents left in a hurry, among whom was Mike Medavoy. They ran after the departing trio. Behind them already crushing each other, and everyone else rushed along. A total of 63 presidents fled. Vice president, producers and heads of various departments. The studio was left without a head in just 1 month. Then they wrote about the disaster which Hollywood has never seen before. 2 years after that, United Artists, which decided to break all known records, box office failure in the shortest possible time, was sold. There's another issue connected to the mass exodus from United Artists. In the 80 year at the box office sank epically. The film Heaven's Gate, which sent westerns to coma for 10 years, and became one of the most iconic flops in Hollywood history, whose name was later mockingly attached to many box office failures, calling Waterworld Gate Kevin, and some Ishtar the Gates of Warren. And it was a United Artist film. Likely all the hell on set can be explained, namely the departure of the entire management from the studio. New people were quickly recruited through advertisements, but their qualifications were questionable. Just imagine that you have to find replacements for all the managers per month, to all deputy managers, and they all won't have time to get acquainted with anything there. Which is what allowed Michael Cimino to move the building along the streets, because the light was falling somehow wrong, as is necessary for a great director, and at a speculative price, rent out a studio on your own land, which was the best land, and install an irrigation system for several $1 million, so that the grass on the best land in the world was the right color. Maybe someone who worked at the studio just before production started would be interested in this very best land and the irrigation system. which she had very necessary. But these people are gone, and those who came to replace them were just trying to sort things out. Yes, and they could have been afraid, take the belt, and whip the Oscar-winning director right in the middle of the best land. The failure of Heaven's Gate, by the way, buried United Artists. More precisely, became the final nail into the coffin lid. After this, the Transamerica company sold she to MGM Studios. From the heights of our days, naturally hard to say who there was more to blame for the Transamerica divorce with the management of United Artists, who ran away, taking with her most of the producers. But it all looks like this: the Transamerica was simply buying up various assets, and to figure out what these assets are, didn't really want. Just she had an opinion for any reason. Well, all the ones who escaped from United Artists gang and organized the Orion studio. The number of stars in the studio's intro is 5 executives. They said they decided to come up with something similar, because there are exactly 5 main stars in the constellation. And there are 5 of them. And everything worked out so cleverly. In fact, the main stars in the constellation more, and in the splash screen itself them more. That's why it worked out not as clever as intended. But the logo turned out to be memorable, so can be forgiven. Your main idea. The new studio announced full creative control for authors. United Artists Studios worked under this model for many years, and just her Transamerica tried to get rid of, which is what pushed the producers to revolution. Since the new studio was packed with so many famous Hollywood people, she was calmly given a loan of $100 million. With this money, they planned to make a couple dozen hits. There were no problems with the authors. With this money, they planned to make a couple dozen hits. There were no problems with the authors. They lined up. Everyone wanted to work with Orion, because in the manual, respected people were sitting, who gave the world dozens of hits. The same Benjamin sat in management at United Artists since the 50s, and him is credited with the success of many cult works. Like The Same, The Good, The Bad and The Ugly, a contract for the distribution of his films. The studio signed with Warner, and Orion's start turned out to be problematic. One of the first stars with which a contract for 2 films was signed became John Travolta. Yes, John's dark streak, because of which he turned into a human with whom no one wanted to work, launched exactly Orion. They signed Travolta after Grease and Saturday Night Fever. He was considered the biggest rising star among all rising stars. This issue was quickly corrected, picked up Orion and Burt Reynolds, which too just starred in box office hits like Smokey and the Bandit, and that Orion started filming in Sharky's Machine, so his stellar career also ended quickly. Of the studio's first 10 projects released in '79, only the melodrama became a hit, 10 with Dudley Moore. The film grossed $107 million at the box office, with a budget of $6 million. If just divide such a cash register in half, it will come out that the studio is only on one film paid back half of his loan. But the film also had advertising costs, which also lay on Orion. And about 20% filmed Warner Studio, for working as a distributor. So in reality, Orion earned about $20 million from the film. And nearby other projects either failed, or they brought a pack of crackers, with which they associate Orion Studios' rejection from Indiana Jones. Initially, Spielberg with Lucas came exactly to Orion, but due to the failures of the first year, the studio couldn't take on required budget.
Got 18 million was needed. At that time, very substantial budget. If put all your eggs in one basket or in 2, then Orion would have managed. But who knew what a huge hit Indiana Jones would become? Already under the roof of Paramount Studios. The most expensive film Orion at that time was a comedy, The Fiendish Plot of Dr. Fu Manchu, which is in theaters, failed abruptly, and spent 10 million on She. And here we need 18 right away. With this money, Orion could have released 2 films, or even 3. That's why Indiana got the boot. By the way, The Fiendish Plot of Dr. Fu Manchu, very creative film. Actor Peter Sellers was given complete creative freedom, and he uses she with all his might. That's why the film has 3 directors. Peter loved to fire directors. Besides himself, he finished filming the movie completely alone. Also changed script writers depending on the weather outside, until the screenwriter was left alone. Sellers couldn't fire himself anymore, so had to endure. As a result, Orion received either a film or someone's thesis. She had to be led into the cinema. The second half of the 80s and 1981 went better for the studio. Movies became hits: Excalibur, Arthur, and Caddyshack. That's just with the existing ones introductory. Orion, all the same, reside on the brink of the subsistence minimum. Worked out, only make new films tightening their belts. There was no money left for anything else. Therefore, at the end of 1981, the contract with Warner Studios was terminated. Distribution was eating up those income who could go for growth, since breaking a contract is not the easiest thing. Rights to all films released under Warner Bros. Had to give it away, having taken out loans and searched for money in their pockets. Was purchased dying distributor Film Voice. In the 50s and 60s, Film Voice was on horseback. But in the 70s, he fizzled out and dragged out a miserable existence, showing various suspicious films. In 1981, on them already a debt hanging in $20 million, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. But she had a well-established distribution network, and hung on the contracts various small chain cinemas, so the purchase was considered justified. According to various sources, the purchase of Orion cost in the amount of $50 to $100 million. With purchase Film Voice, things at Orion got even worse. Money for filming movies just isn't any left, and projects rolled out not the most freshest. The bet was made to the trash, which no one takes of the big players, but in him can make something out. If look really closely, one such film was found. He and saved Orion from bankruptcy. Yes, that's the one which Sylvester Stallone personally proposed, buy it out, and burn in the oven. Before that, it looked disgusting in his eyes, that he was even ready to shoot himself. True, Stallone later changed his mind, when after the next edited version, in the film Stallone became silent, like a partisan. Initially he was very talkative, and told everyone about his life, about how it should be live, how many stars are there in the sky, and how he single-handedly defeated Vietnam. And everyone around knew about this. It's not like Sly single-handedly defeated Vietnam, and the fact that the movie doesn't work, and turned out some nonsense, so the big movie distributors wrote it off, and the movie was re-edited, and began to offer to those who weren't afraid. Among those who remained, Orion also lingered. Orion has acquired the rights to distribute films in the state. How much did it cost her, unknown, but the whole film cost $15 million, and they are unlikely gave away more than $5 for him. Grossed $48 million at the American box office. The film was distributed around the world by other distributors, so the $78 million that the film made in other countries went to someone else. Exactly at this moment, Orion Studios attempted to buy again Mario Casar and Andrew Vajna. Exactly, they stood behind Rambo, but they couldn't distribute the movies themselves yet, and they were refused again. Or maybe they didn't have enough money. Vajna and Casar are guys dexterous, and usually many were offered to pay some other time. When this or that film grosses a lot of millions, and if they suddenly don't collect, then later may stretch, and will have to wait a little longer. This success allowed Orion not only to survive, but also to expand. The studio has separate television division, and a section for suspicious films. That's it now. Was engaged in those very same films that no one needs around, which had to run with a microscope. Usually these were films from other countries. This branch released the same one in the States, ran by Akira Kurosawa. And the television department issued one of the main American TV series hits 80s, Cagney and Lacey. But at the main studio, the year 83 was a failure again. And 84's as is standard for the studio led she to bankruptcy. Sang a new variation, The Bounty, and even more uncle helped talented nephew, issued The Cotton Club, which became one of the most expensive films of the 1980s, and at the same time, one of the most disastrous. Orion Studios is lucky that she worked for him only as a distributor, and spent money only on marketing. Krim later said, what if they fully financed The Cotton Club? Then they would immediately go bankrupt. But something saved them, and they only lost on the film, only $4 million. Corrected studio affair. Second half of 1984. And it would be possible to tear a couple of drums out of happiness if the biggest hit of 1984 for the studio was theirs. But most part of the profit came from the first Terminator. Like the studio, Hemdale, Orion acted on the film only as a distributor. Terminator grossed $78 million at the box office, with a budget in $6. Next to him did a great job Amadeus and The Woman in Red. Life was starting to get better. And the year 85th came? Who gave a ride Orion the biggest box office failure of its time. One of the studio's executives later said that things were going well for them. In 1984, out of 15 films, which they worked on, 10 brought profit. On 3, they were able to reach the level of a bitten Snickers, and 2 more brought losses, thanks to Francis Ford. But there was one very serious problem. They didn't have a mega hit, who couldn't alone keep them for a couple of years, ensuring against other failures. And they desperately in him needed to take a deep breath and stop counting every penny. The first Rambo could have been such a film, but most of the income there came from the international box office. And in worldwide distribution, Orion was not engaged the picture. That's why the decision was made: create for yourself this very blockbuster who will abandon the studio to the next stage of development. This film became Remo Williams. The Adventure Begins, and invested in him $40 million. At that time, huge money. Taking inflation into account now, it would be $15 million. But with all the other nuances, budget most likely would have flown over the 200 mark, because many Orion executives worked on the Bond series, which fed the studio United Artists. Make a blockbuster for Orion. They also decided about Bond. They just called it differently. To exactly everything worked out. Director took Guy Hamilton, who filmed Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun. These were all very successful Bond films. Goldfinger, and was generally considered the best Bond film. The script has begun to be written. Christopher Wood, who is responsible for The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. All in all, gathered a group of specialists, pick-a-back, in which have been continuous successes with the Bond films, and asked them something like that. Only James Bond name, Remo Williams. After the release of this film, careers Guy Hamilton and Christopher Wood ended immediately. At the box office, Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins, collected only $14 million, with a budget of $40. Audience ratings, by the way, he has, not that bad, so that impressive failure blame on them, likely the film yet, and interfered competition. The film was released on the same day as the action film Commando and thriller Jagged Edge. And yes, their total budget was doubled, less than Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins. So scary competitor should have looked like exactly him. But, in reality, worked out what is the 10 millionth, Commando collected $58 million, and the 10 millionth, Jagged Edge, $45 million. The only one's 2 successes in 1985 year for the studio. The film became Chuck Norris Code of Silence, and comedy drama, Desperately Seeking Susan. Second picture, we have to Madonna's attempts become a talented actress. The film performed well at the box office, grossing $27 million on a budget of $5 million, and into her various nominations flew in. Madonna wasn't nominated, but she was praised and saw great potential. And most importantly, the success of the film was also associated with her. Before him, she wasn't particularly famous, but when Him was filmed, Madonna had released her breakthrough album, which immediately made her a musical superstar. The filmmakers said that filming started quietly and calm. They could walk the streets hither and thither, and no one before them wasn't any business. And then the album Madonna came out, and they had to increase the film's budget by $500,000. Security was needed to catch the singer's fans, and shot the most impudent ones, because they climbed over fences, broke into the film set, and didn't give shoot outdoors. Therefore, after crowds of people ripped them off a couple of days of filming, had to pay police, specialists with batons, which from early morning, they started to drive around the area, crowds of fans. Sometimes the police got into trouble too. Some Madonna fan even got a real prison sentence. However, Madonna was unable to save the year. The studio is too strong, went into the minus. Because of what in the early stages of creation were closed at once several projects, in including a slasher from Brian De Palma. To him, even managed to film enticing trailer. Everything was already ready for filming, but wasn't enough money for everyone. And the film was cancelled, leaving Brian out in the cold. Titan Belts gave their results in the year 86. The studio has a hit comedy, Back to School. It was entirely a film studio, with a budget of 11 million. Only for domestic distribution, it collected 91 million. Not bad. Come out and drama Hannah and Her Sisters, which grossed 40 million, with a budget of 6. Could have happened, even that mega hit, which the studio needed so much, The Rental Exploded Platoon by Oliver Stone. The film grossed $138 million on the budget of $6 million. But here again was a division of rights, and Orion received only a portion of the profits. But in any case, the year 86 was very successful, which allowed Orion to increase the budgets of their projects for 87 year, in which they finally got their own franchise, which was only theirs. Another one appeared, but at that time, she wasn't considered a franchise yet, which is why, in the future, Orion and will make one of his most fatal mistakes. In 1987 year, the film was released by Kevin Costner, No Way Out. The film grossed 53 million on a 15 million budget. Your way to the film adaptation of the Telephone Directory. Kevin started specifically at the Orion studio. RoboCop grossed 54 million on a 13 million budget. Travel in Rental. They started out with a 1-month difference. After them, there's more and greater comedy performed. Throw Mama from the Train, which grossed 58 million on a budget of 14. Films of the studio in 1987 received 18 Academy Award nominations. This was more than any other Hollywood studio, and 2 successful years in a row pushed Orion on the path of expansion, which is usually and called a big mistake. 3 new units were created. One was doing distribution of the studio's films on video. The second one worked with international distribution, and the third absorbed the existing television division. Having launched a string of different series and entertainment shows, the necessary expenses for maintaining the studio increased threefold. Converted pay attention to the studio and large companies who were engaged in other businesses but wanted to go to the cinema. Metro Media Conglomerate from 1987 to 1988 bought 30% of Orion's shares. 26% was won by the Redstone concern, after which they began to fight with each other and go to the press with various loud slogans, in which the opponents were called worms, rats, and really bad words. In 1989 year, Metro Media won in the number of stories. Who, whom and where, they were able to buy up 67% of the shares. Wrote that they didn't really need them. But billionaire John Clue fumed at any insult and turned the war into a personal vendetta. Because he spent more money on donuts than he paid for control of Orion, he went to the end just to clean up the Redstone concern. While the war in 1988 was gaining momentum, the studio had several hits. Helped again Kevin Costner with your Bull Durham. They have a budget of 7 million, collected 51, performed well, and Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, with a police drama, Colors. Everything was somehow too good, and therefore 89 year became the worst year for Orion, with She founding. The studio received his second biggest failure, Belmont. The film grossed only $1 million, with a budget of 33. Fail in a row, Speed Zone, which cost 18 million and collected 3. Great Balls of Fire, which cost 16, but collected 13. Rude Awakening, which cost 10, but collected 3. She Devil, which cost 18, but only collected 16. In total, out of 13 films the studio made in 1989, only one did not fail, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He grossed 40 million on a budget of 10, but to make up for all the losses, he naturally was not able. Studio went into minus by almost 100 million. In 1990, the studio continued immersion. The first to go to the bottom, Everybody Wins, which cost 19 million and grossed the whole one. They failed after him, Cadillac Man and Navy SEALs. The second RoboCop was supposed to save everyone in the summer of 1990. On him have already spent between 30 and 35 million. It was the second lowest budgeted film in the history of Orion Studios. He was supposed half as much, but the film went into production hell. The original script was rewritten by everyone who could rewrite something. The people on the set couldn't understand what kind of movie they were making. They filmed one day according to one script, and the next day, the director was already filming some other movie, and the script was only with him, because he also liked to rewrite something. This whole transformer reached the big screens in June of 1990, and in domestic distribution, the film grossed 45 million. Since the film had been languishing in the studio's depths for almost 3 years, contracts on rental worldwide, the studio had already signed at that time, when she didn't have any own global distribution division. The film's worldwide box office is unknown, because the film was sold to local distributors, but believed that she was not bad. So, although the film failed in the States, taking into account sales around the world, the studio probably made enough money to buy a basket of beans, which is why the third film appeared, whose budget was severely cut. But he still went to work. But the studio situation was catastrophic. From her manual, important people ran. In the 90th year, Orion had to collapse yours international branch and sign a contract with Sony Studios, which should have applied for distributing Orion films throughout the world, except USA. And yes, at the end of 1990, in the box office hit, new Kevin Costner from the studio Orion, which was called Dances with Wolves, and in the world, him rolled no longer Orion. Moreover, due to financial problems and failures, the studio didn't really believe in this kind of film, and when him was filmed, refused to add the budget required Costner. So, he covered part of the budget from his own pocket, for which he received a fat percentage of the rental income, and Orion Studio got a few crumbs from the bagel. The $22 million film grossed $424 million at the box office. It was just that mega hit, which the studio so needed, just because of all the problems that fell upon her in the late 1980s. She got rid of most of her income, which she could have received on the film. The situation is very similar to Kawako, which went down the drain because of Showgirls. And then already at the MGM studio, film became the best-selling on video release for all She history. But the main problem for Orion was not that what did they get for Dances with Wolves, less than they could. All the other films of the 90s failed or fell short. So the studio continued to fall into the abyss, gradually accelerating. Most likely, the studio announced with itself already bankrupt in 1990. Rescued cash injection from Metro Media, but John Clue was not a great expert in cinema, so many of his steps now look like nails in the lid coffin. He, for example, ordered the sale of the Addams Family as an obviously dead asset to return some of the money back, and part of the money was returned. What in that moment made someone happy? That's just when is the movie threw out for rent already, a studio Paramount. It collected 191 million. At Orion, only the rights remain to several countries around the world. How much did they earn there? Unknown. And so the exodus of professionals from the studio has only intensified, and Metro Media began to close all divisions of the company. Television also came under attack. All television assets were acquired by Disney's ABC channel. Besides the Addams Family, in 1991, there was another funny situation, most likely even funnier. At the studio happened another mega hit, The Silence of the Lambs. He grossed 272 million on a budget of 19, 130 of which were from domestic rentals. around the world of cinema rental, not Orion. And their studio received only some small percentage. In 90th and 91st year, the Dying Studios films won Oscars for the best film of the year and became the main winners of the award. There were a lot of jokes about this topic, like those where the academics like to award films where someone is sick or dying. Here are the films from Orion Reward. Because of that, what the studio is in a coma, all other Orion projects of 1991 failed again, including a sequel, FAX2, and Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. At the beginning of 92 left the studio the last of the Orion founders, Eric Pleskov, who reported then the studio can't be saved anymore. At the same time, Orion declared bankruptcy because of what the deal fell through with the then still independent New Line Cinema. Metromedia wanted more money than ready was to give away New Line Cinema. Plus to this, she still and would get debts Orion, which by that time exceeded $200 million. The sum itself deals never voiced, tried to approach to Orion and Sony Studio, but two couldn't or didn't want to pay the stated price. Metromedia has suspended operations over several at-once projects, the filming of which was already underway. Among them was third RoboCop. At the very end of 92nd, Orion emerged from bankruptcy proceedings. All the people who escaped were replaced by someone. Some of the loans were repaid. Metromedia, having failed to dump the asset, unfroze all the projects and finished them, reducing necessary expenses to the bare minimum. Strongest of all because of this naturally suffered RoboCop 3. From him thrown out almost all action scenes, and some were redone under a much more budget option, got by final film at 20 million and grossed 11 at the box office. All films which the studio released from 92nd to 96th year failed. Some of them were awarded prizes, and some of them were liked by the audience even when they were released on video. That in another situation wouldn't be so bad, since there were no big budget flops, but for the half-dead studio, this was a death sentence. In 1997 year, Metromedia gave up and sold Orion to MGM Studios. And also MGM yet, for $225 million, bought the rights at Warner Bros. To the first Orion films, which were released at the very beginning of the 80s. Total transaction amount also never voiced, but they said that the MGM library, Orion, from 2,000 different projects, got for practically for nothing. How much is this peanuts in millions, can only guess. Orion wasn't shut down completely, and she worked on some small projects for MGM Studios. Simply she logo was not used. Tried to revive the studio in 2013. Under her brand, they released a couple of slashers, like The Town That Dreaded Sundown. With a budget of $3 million, he collected at the box office $120,000. Even more successful became a release, The Barnaby, which cost $5 million and collected $10,000 at the box office. The film was shown only a couple of weeks in several cinemas, but the studio had one success, Child's Play 2019 year. The film cost $10 million and grossed $44 at the box office. Maybe MGM would be so sometimes and use the powers Orion in small picture. But there was a purchase of MGM by Amazon service, after which Orion began working over 1 or 2 films a year. Last year their film even got into an Oscar award. They stand for Nickel Boys. He has 2 nominations. The film, as usual, failed at the box office. In short, these days, Orion is kind of there, but kind of not. Logo, she is rarely used. Just MGM doesn't destroy the name itself, as it often happens, and uses the remaining small division when working on small paintings, which is called Orion Pictures, which naturally can't name even a pale shadow of the past. But officially the studio did not cease your existence, just became an analog, some small production company, simply enslaved. From the founders of the studio's successful career outside, Orion built only by Mike Medavoy. He ran away one of the first from the studio, at the beginning of 1992 year and became the head of the studio TriStar Pictures. But in 94 year, had a falling out with Sony Studios and left, founding the Phoenix Studio. She worked on over many famous pictures, like The Thin Red Line and Shutter Island. Can be assumed that at Mike everything worked out well. A unkempt belly button, because of the desire to be big and important, ruined many Hollywood studios. Not only the Carolco Pictures, whom simply remembers more often than others, because of various sublime films. Studios Orion was stricken by similar problems, and cult films she has no less, and perhaps even more.